spend a fair bit. So John will spend some time talking about the ETVMA, the memorial itself, how it came to be, how we were able to identify the various people who are memorialized on that. And then I'll kind of come in with a little bit of talk about our book. We spent some time working on this book. It was certainly a labor of love. I think you'd agree, John. It took us, what, roughly 4 years to do it.
That's right. And I'd like to add, and I'll add a few more things a bit later, is that the genesis of the book came about from both my service on the board of East Tennessee Veterans Memorial. I was president, I think, for 3 years, and also my own work with students, taking them to Normandy, France, as part of our Normandy Scholars Program at UT that began in 1993 and ended in 2002. So that's how that happened. It was the inspiration for it, at least for me. And it was basically, you said 4 years, and that's right, Nick, because I began working on the book in 2016 in the summer. And basically what I did, because we already had a fairly large website with lots of information on the various people whose names are on the memorial, was I went through every page of the 6,200 that actually had information, or there were actually less at that point that had full information. And I tried to cull out, what I thought were the stories that would be most evocative of what our goal was with the book. And then, of course, there was the difficult process of winnowing it down to the stories that fit basically what our approach was in terms of the different chapters and such. Then Nick came in on the project, and that made it a whole lot better because he knows a whole lot more military history than I do. So we were a great team.
Great. Well, with that, John, I'll go ahead and let you kick off on the history of the project, the history of the memorial, how it came to be, Colonel Bill Felton, and all of that.
Next slide. Nothing much to say here other than this is a shot of the memorial, and really good, the LNN station there in the background. The site was, there were at least 3 sites we entertained for a location for memorial. This one was ideal for us in the end because we had a lot of space and we got approval from the city for it. And it's important historically also because, I mean, the LNN station, there was a lot of traffic, rail traffic through there during World War I and certainly World War II. So that it made it all the more compelling to locate in fact, the old rail tracks that were where the memorial is went right by there. Okay, next slide. Bill Felton, I don't know, anybody know Bill Felton back in the day? He was a real estate person here, and he had this vision of building a memorial in Knoxville, realizing there really wasn't one to speak of. Mainly, he was thinking originally, we were thinking World War II. He had been to Normandy with his wife, and when he came home, he was so inspired and blown away by that experience that when he came home, he realized, hey, we don't have much here. We got the Buck Carnes Bridge, we have Troy McGill Highway, but we don't have much about the conflict and all the people that were involved from this area. And it was at the outset we were thinking, well, we're just going to do Knox County, or we'll do the 9 counties. And then all of a sudden we thought, okay, let's have a more ambitious vision. And that's when we decided to go with the 35 county approach, which is what the East Tennessee History Center recognizes as the East Tennessee area. And boy, did that spread it out and added a lot of work for us. But that was fantastic. Next slide. So Bill Felton, yes, 1999, that was his trip. The memorial, I started meeting with Bill and a few others in 2002. And we got a lot of other great board members that joined us. And the construction of the memorial began, I think, a year before in 2007 and was dedicated in November of 2008. And key players in it were, of course, in terms of fundraising, were former Knox County Mayor Mike Ragsdale, Congressman Jimmy Duncan, and many others. Plus those, we got corporate donations from individuals, companies, and such. Next slide. Okay, and Nick, we'll update this. You know, we've been saying 6,200 all along because that actually goes back several years when we did have 6,200. But since then, because of research that's being done by a lot of great volunteers, including, well, I'll mention them in a minute, we're over 6,300 names now on the memorial. And those names are distributed around at the memorial by conflict. Earlier conflicts are at the earlier part, entrance to the memorial, World War I, all the way through World War II, to Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. And we also have a memorial stone for peacetime. A number of people who died in training accidents and others who are from the 35 counties of East Tennessee who are remembered on that particular column. So the names are engraved, as you see, by conflict. We actually have 4 women on the columns, and we have a special arrangement of columns for the 14 Medal of Honor recipients. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have visited the memorial, have been there? Do we know? Tammy, can you see?
I don't really have anybody raise their hands or anything at this point. Sorry, John.
Okay. Well, it's well worth it. It's, you know, downtown, and
there's a couple of that.
Okay, great. As we know, the downtown's the place, but Knoxville's the place to be right now, and it's not far from there. So, all righty, let's go to the next slide, please. This is interesting, this chart, because it is a list of all of the names, not the names, but the number of names from the various conflicts and counties, and alphabetically beginning with Anderson and going all the way down to Washington. And I'm going to see if I can move this thing right here. Yes, I did. As you would expect, if you scroll down to the very bottom, World War II, let me go back. World War II had the highest number of names with 4,001 overall. And out of the 6,000, so roughly 60%. And we have also Knox County, a large number of casualties there. I need to move this thing around. There we go. Knox County with 4 overall. Knox County with 903. Interestingly, and we did include Hamilton County because it's part of East Tennessee. Sometimes I don't think the folks in Chattanooga think of themselves as being in East Tennessee, maybe more in Georgia, but they had a larger population, a larger number of casualties in the conflict, 944 versus Knoxville's 903. And I did, just out of curiosity, look up what the census was in 1940 for both Knoxville as a city and Hamilton County as a city. And Hamilton County back then in 1940 had a population of 16,000 more than Knoxville did, which is interesting. So basically, as you see, the conflicts, the number of people who died in those conflicts or were killed or died because of illness or accident, huge for World War II. And then Korea was a briefer conflict, but still very, very bloody with 447. And of course, Vietnam, most of us are maybe not Nick, but a lot of us are in that Vietnam generation with a very sad number of 671. So I can answer, if anyone have any comments or questions on this, but we can take questions right now just on this. Is this anything stand out to you? Maybe not. Okay, we'll save questions for later. Next slide. Nick, are you going to do this
one thing I might ask you to talk about before I kind of pick it up here, John, is to talk a little bit about our volunteers, the people who have helped us in identifying the names and collecting more information.
Yes, and you're right. I moved on to you too quickly. Yes, with the original research for the names on the memorial, we contracted with the Center for the Study of War and Society at UT. And they went to work over several years, traveling, calling people, getting the information as they could from the various counties in terms of the names that should go on the memorial. And they did a terrific job. And then once the memorial was in place, we began, of course, getting further information that we left out a name and whatever, and all this. And we got a lot of great volunteers. And, she continues as a volunteer right now. This is Cynthia Tinker with the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial. She is doing a project now for the university. The university is setting up a memorial on the campus for those who died in service, who were UT graduates. So she has found, during that process, she's found more names for us to include. And by the way, we engrave those names just before Memorial Day every year. And then there's a dedication ceremony on Memorial Day, when we also read all now over 6,300 names on the memorial. It's quite an event, worth attending. We also found a volunteer from, of all places, the Netherlands, Astrid van Erp. She contacted us because she was doing work for the Fields of Honor. The Dutch are very, very involved in preserving the cemeteries in there, and they have a program called Fields of Honor. So this was Astrid van Erp, and she volunteered, and she's done a ton of work for us, all volunteer pro bono. And at the same time, Nick, was it around 2013, 14?
About 2012, when she came over.
Okay. We invited her to come to one of our Medal of Honor dinners, and we, awarded her a special commendation. And she's still there. She's just turning them over. She has these names on her list that are on the memorial, but we don't have full information on them. And she continues to work on that, as I said, totally in her own free time. All right, Nick, does that cover that part of it pretty well?
I think that covers that well. And so one of the things that John just alluded to when we're thinking about memorial activities is obviously every Memorial Day Monday, starting very early in the morning, we have the annual reading of the names for all of the over 6,300 who are represented on the memorial. Their name is read in a very stately and solemn manner. As you can imagine, that lasts several hours. So that's something you can count on every year. Yeah. Another thing you can count on every year is that typically we also have on the first Monday in May, our annual Medal of Honor dinner. Now, we did it out of cycle this year. Obviously, last year with coronavirus, we weren't able to have one. And due to the earlier instance of the Delta variant, we had to push it back a bit. But we actually just had our annual Medal of Honor dinner a few weeks ago. We're going to get back on cycle and have that again the first Monday in May starting next year. We take one of the 14 Medal of Honor recipients from East Tennessee. We strike a commemorative coin, which is fairly beautiful and distinctive. But more than that, we typically get a very well-known speaker on military history or someone who is versed in the genealogy of the person and his family being represented. And we have them come make a presentation. It's become, probably one of the not only an excellent fundraising tool for the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial Association, but honestly, an excellent way also for us in the community to remember and recognize the service and sacrifice of the 14 Medal of Honor recipients. So as we see here, other things that can be done and often are done at the memorial include military promotions, military commissioning ceremonies, retirements, and change of commands. In the fall of 2013, the Congressional Medal of Honor flag was raised to commemorate our selection as a host city for the 2014 Congressional Medal of Honor Society Convention. And by the way, that flag was just again raised here a few weeks ago because the Congressional Medal of Honor Society will hold its convention in Knoxville again next year. And ETVMA certainly will have a role in working with that. Next slide, please, Tammy. So this will now give you a flavor of the various chapters and topics we cover in the book. And as you've noted, and as John covered with you earlier, we're speaking about casualties. largely casualties and deaths in wartime or as a direct result of wartime from World War I through the present day, but also some peacetime casualties are represented as well. We think that we have tried to arrive at a very selective sampling of some fairly common themes, but also some very unique and unusual stories and circumstances for some of the veterans from East Tennessee who fought and died in these conflicts. And this chapter will give you a little bit of idea of that. So rather than go ahead and go into great detail in the chapter and give away a lot of the book, what we're going to do now in roughly the next 20 to 25 minutes is go through some of these recurring themes and talk selectively about them and give you a flavor and an idea of some of the stories, some of the legends, some of the contributions made by these over 6,300 East Tennesseans who served in the duty of our nation. Next slide, please.
And Nick, I might add to that, that if you go back to table of contents, we don't have to do that right now. But, you know, when we had sent this book out for review, one of our readers said, well, why don't you do it chronologically? And we thought about that, but then in the we decided a thematic approach would work better with the stories that we had than doing it just, you know, totally chronological.
So obviously, anything that we're doing with the memorial, we have to recognize is a paramount theme, the service and sacrifice of the 14 Medal of Honor recipients from East Tennessee. And so here you see photos of all 14. Each one of them we have had or we will have a Medal of Honor dinner for to recognize their contributions. I think the one that I'll single out is if you look at the second from the right in the topmost row, there is a kind of a clean-shaven, very short-haired gentleman wearing a Marine Corps cap. Many of you may recognize that is Alexander Sandy Bonnyman, whose remains were lost after the Battle of Tarawa in 1943 for many, many years. And so ETVMA had a bit of a role in his return to Knoxville. His remains were finally found by a team from a group called History Flight, which also included his grandson, Clay Bonnyman Evans. When those remains were found, classified by the military's graves registration and missing soldiers processing units in Hawaii, that he ultimately was brought back for burial here in Knoxville. And his remains were actually on display at the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial for about a day so that members of the general public could come by and pay their tribute and their respects to him. So that's another way that the organization has been able to really help recognize, not just all the Medal of Honor recipients as we do, but one particular one, in this case, Sandy Bonnyman. Next slide, please. So going back, the first people who are recognized by memorial certainly go back to that war that once upon a time was called the Great War, the war to end all war, the First World War. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the stories of many of the people from across the 35 counties who served in that war, many of whom were members of the Tennessee National Guard and served with a unit called the 30th Division, better known as the Old Hickory Division, because the soldiers were drawn from Andrew Jackson's home states of Tennessee and the Carolinas. They saw major service not in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, as is often thought, which is where most of the U.S. Army soldiers fought in the First World War. Interestingly, the soldiers of the Old Hickory unit end up fighting alongside the British for quite a few months in an area in northern France and in southern Belgium. So many of the casualties who fought and died as part of this unit were people who fought and died alongside British and Australian units in another American division. And that's just an interesting piece of World War I history, but it also impacted the way that these guys these soldiers lived, fought and died. It would also be absolutely remiss for us to mention one other important fact, something that the last year and a half or so have reminded us of, which is the power of disease, the power of illness, and the threats posed by pandemics. Long before COVID, as we all know, and certainly have heard in the last year and a half, one of the greatest pandemics to rack the United States was what was called Spanish influenza, which started in 1918 and lasted in 1920. Some of the faces in this general collection of soldiers who served with the 30th Division didn't die in combat or from the combat wounds. Some of them, quite a large proportion, in fact, died from the Spanish flu. And when we began researching and looking at the lives of many of the soldiers from East Tennessee who died in First World War, by a significant factor, many more of them died from the consequences of Spanish flu, which was sometimes also identified as a form of pneumonia, or the old term grip was used, than actually died as a direct result from combat. And that's something now that, we as a society and a nation, having lived through, and a world having lived through what we have lived through for about the last year and a half, I think it's something that, has relevance to us, even not in the context of war, but just our day-to-day lives. And that's something worth noting. Next slide, please. Now, one of the other things that I think John and I appreciated about writing this book is, as we mentioned earlier, when we talked about Colonel Bill Felton, after he went and saw the American Battle Monument Cemetery at Omaha Beach and thought about Knoxville, he said, well, there's a Buck Carnes Bridge, there's this, there's that. And one of the things he probably thought about as well is there was an airport named Mcgee Tyson. So what we did is also, by writing this book, not just hopefully tell a lot of general information that will be of interest to historians, general readers, genealogists, family members, et cetera, but it may also fill in the reason why some of these local monuments are named the way they are. And in this slide, we're going to kind of get into that a little bit. So two of the early aviation pioneers are actually from East Tennessee. They both played roles in the First World War. The one on the left is a fellow named Kiffin Rockwell. He was originally from Newport. He spent some time also living in Asheville, North Carolina. You can actually see memorial signs and markers for him in Newport and in Asheville. But when World War I began, he wasn't content to wait for America to get drawn into the war. He and his brother said, what the Germans are doing in Europe is horrifying. Let's go fight. So he and his brother joined the French Foreign Legion. When they learned that the French Air Service was starting an aviation unit, he said, get me out of these trenches. I want to learn how to fly. And Kiffin Rockwell became one of the very first members of a unit that now is famously known as the Lafayette Escadrille. So he was an American pilot who fought with the French starting about 1916. And he ultimately died in combat. He is truly a hero of both nations. As you'll see, his name is listed on a wall. That wall happens to be the Pantheon in Paris, one of the very few American names you will see there. But he is recognized not just as an American hero, but as a French hero to this day. Now, on the right is none other than Charles Mcgee Tyson. He was a son of Lawrence Tyson, who was a U.S. Army general at West Pointer, had fought in the Old West and also fought in the Spanish-American War. Very patriotic family, strong Knoxville connections. Charles Mcgee Tyson, following his father's stead, said, there's a war on, I'm going to get in it, and I want to fly also. So he became one of the first aviators in the U.S. Navy's Air Service. And sadly, having learned how to fly seaplanes, was on an anti-German submarine patrol off the coast of Britain when, on October 11th, 1918, his plane crashed and he was killed. And he is now memorialized, obviously, at Mcgee Tyson Airport. But think about one thing I'd say is think about that date. October 11th, 1918 was exactly 1 month before the end of the war. He died so close to the end. Next slide, please. Some of the stories that John and I recount are truly not just tragic, but fairly horrifying. And we would be remiss, though, if we did not think about the circumstances and the ways that some of these East Tennesseans suffered and died. And so some of the most disturbing stories that we have had to chronicle in our account concerns the soldiers who in 1942 fell when America surrendered the Philippines to the Japanese, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March, but then something that is less known, the consequences that followed that death march. So, several people died either on the Bataan Death March or in POW camps that were just absolutely horrifying that the Japanese built in the Philippines. And then later more died when, as the Japanese decided to empty out those prison camps and transfer American and Allied prisoners to labor camps in Japan, in Korea, in Manchuria, and other places, they loaded them up on overcrowded transport ships and sailed them from the Philippines to these other locations. And those ships were called the Hell ships for obvious reasons. At least 2 Bradley Countyans were among the people who were captured in the Philippines when it fell. One of them was Private Wayman Sandage, who served with the 59th Coast Artillery Regiment. Another officer, Major Paul Jones, served with the 26th Cavalry, a Philippine Scout unit. Both were captured on Bataan. Both survived the hell of the Death March, but both were lost at sea on a Japanese hell ship named the Arisan Maru. You see a photograph on the right-hand side, an unmarked freighter that was sunk by an American submarine, the USS Shark, in October 1944. Only 9 of 1,800 American POWs on this ship survived. I wish I could say that the loss of these two East Tennesseans was limited solely to the sinking of the Arisan Maru, but sadly I cannot. There were quite a few hell ships, and quite a few East Tennesseans died on these overcrowded, no water, no food type situations. And sadly, so many of them were sunk by Allied submarines who, because the Japanese did not identify these ships as being, with Red Cross markings or as being ships that were carrying POWs, were regarded as rightful targets by the Allied navies. And unfortunately, many of their own soldiers and sailors were killed in the process. It's just an absolute tragedy. Next slide, please. Now, there is another naval tragedy, which probably is familiar to, if not everybody on this call, then certainly a great deal of you all, at least the people who remember that movie from 1976, Jaws. And that was the infamous sinking of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, which was sunk only a matter of days before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ship was sunk on July 30th, 1945. It was connected actually to the atomic bombings because the Indianapolis was a ship that sailed to an island called Tinian, which was where the two B-29s that dropped atomic bombs were launched from, carrying components for one of those atomic bombs. And of a ship that is fairly sizable, we're talking roughly 1,200 people that made up the crew of this heavy cruiser. 22 East Tennesseans died aboard the Indianapolis after it sank, or due to the consequences of the survivors being left in the water for many days before the Navy realized that the ship had not returned to port, was well behind its timetable, and finally sent out aircraft to locate and find the handful of survivors that were left. Of these, these photographs depict several people. The one on the far left is a Knoxvillian whose name may be recognized by some of you. He was Lieutenant Commander Earl Henry. He was a ship's dentist, but he also was an amateur ornithologist, very expert in bird calls and bird identification. For those of you who, like I do, love the IAMS Center, you will notice that there is a trail named in memory of Earl Henry. He was a ship's dentist. He went down on the Indianapolis. Next to him, you see Lieutenant Commander Kyle Moore, who also was a Knoxville, also went down on the ship. The last two are a pair of sailors, Ralph Holloway and Clifford Owensby. These both were from Marion County, as were two other sailors, Thomas H. Jordan and Alton Phillips. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Marion County, it's not a particularly large county in 2021, but if you think about 1944, 1945, Marion County was an extremely small county. With 4 sailors who died on that same ship, first, they all had to have known each other. What are the odds of 4 sailors from a tiny county like Marion County being aboard this particular warship? And what are the odds of 4 of them dying? That had to have been traumatic for the citizens of that county, not just their family members and friends. One more story, please. Turn the slide. This is another story that, again, just kind of impacts, not, as opposed to the case of Marion County suffering such a major hit. This concerns an individual family's double loss. On the left-hand side, the transport ship you see is a fairly famous one. It is the Uss Transport Dorchester. The reason this ship is generally recognized by people, it is as famous for the story of the 5 chaplains. The Dorchester had a significant crew of Americans on board, and it was sailing to Britain when it was torpedoed and sunk in February 1943. This is a ship on which a group of U.S. Army chaplains gave up their life preservers from various Christian and Jewish churches and temples. They linked arms and stood on the deck of the ship and said prayers as the ship went down. All 5 of the chaplains were lost. So that is one of the things that makes this ship very famous. Now, unfortunately, also lost on the ship was a young East Tennessean by the name of Peter Zucchini. His sister was at the time a U.S. Navy nurse. And you see her on the right-hand side. Her name was Julia Zucchini. Julia ultimately saw service in the South Pacific. She was involved in a naval hospital that clearly treated casualties from the air, land, and sea battles around Guadalcanal, it appears that she suffered pretty significant trauma and possibly even PTSD from what she saw as a nurse treating all these veterans. She ultimately was transferred back to serve as a nurse at the Millington Naval Air Station outside Memphis. And she died on her 29th birthday, October 1944. So you think about the death first of the son, then of the daughter. Worth noting too that Julia is one of the 4 women recognized on the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial. But you think about a small Italian American, American family that lived basically in the area around Jellicoe. What a powerful, what a traumatic effect the loss of these 2 siblings must have had on that family. Again, as John and I have had to research and look at these stories, it's hard not to feel a real pang of loss as you research and think about what the consequences of these lives and their loss were to so many people, not just immediate families, but others around them and others in their community. Next slide, please. This one concerns yet another maritime sinking, but this is one that has kind of a bit of a unique edge to it because it concerned a German secret weapon, and the sinking was in fact the survivors of the sinking were ordered to keep it confidential for many years. A British transport called the HMT Rona was a vessel that was actually used to carry a lot of American personnel to North Africa and Italy. And it sank in 1943. What happened is when the Rona was sunk, it wasn't just sunk by a torpedo from a German submarine, or let's say one of the more typical ways for a transport to be lost at sea. Instead, it was actually sunk by a German secret weapon. The photo you see underneath the picture of the Rona, which went down with over 1,000 American troops, is a German aircraft, and attached to its wing is a strange-looking device. That is called a Henschel 293. It was, in fact, one of the world's first cruise missiles. It was radio-guided from this airplane. The fact that the Germans successfully sank the Rona and later other Allied ships was something that was kept extremely secret by the Allied forces. In fact, the survivors were told for many years not to discuss the consequences of how the Rona was sunk. So the person that you see then in the right-hand side is Private First Class Jesse Poteet. He was from Bradley County. He served with the 853rd Engineer Battalion, and coincidentally, he was not the only person from that battalion who was on the Rona and died. At least 5 other East Tennesseans went down when that ship was sunk by this German secret weapon. It might be worth noting that the story is interesting enough that a documentary is now being produced on it. So we'll have to see at some point in time when that's released to the public. Next slide, please. Obviously, a lot of stories from World War II. This is another story from World War II, and this is one where, in a few minutes, as you'll see, this gets a little more personal for me. The ship that you see is a destroyer escort that was called the Samuel B. Roberts. It fought at a battle that, the larger battle is known as the Battle of Lady Gulf, but it fought at a sub-battle of that was called the Naval Battle off Samar. The reason I said that this is a little more personal to me is the fellow in the photograph, James Kenneth Weaver, is my great uncle by marriage. He was my wife's great uncle and my mother-in-law's uncle. Young man from Bristol, Tennessee. My mother remembers him very well to this day. She said that of all his relatives, he was her favorite uncle. And he went down in October 1944 when a massive Japanese task force tried to destroy MacArthur's landings at the Lady Gulf beachhead by coming in and attacking an area where the U.S. Navy was weakest. The Samuel B. Roberts was one of the ships that was there. It and several other ships fought very gallantly and ultimately stopped the Japanese battleship fleet from getting close to bombarding the Lady Gulf beachhead. So in a sense, they succeeded. But the Samuel B. Roberts and several other American ships were lost in what was referred to as the last stand of the Tin Can Sailors. One can certainly say it was a glorious fight, but for the people who lost family members like Kenneth Roberts, it's certainly something that we remember to this day and cannot be forgotten. Next slide, please. We're going to move out of World War II here shortly, but there is another just fascinating set of coincidences that I think that it was worth talking about here, and that is that the 2 last bombers to fall during World War II in both the Pacific and the European theaters had East Tennesseans aboard. So the first one you see here is a picture of a B-29 bomber. It was a B-29 very much like like this one that you see, that in a time right before Victory over Japan Day. So we're talking September 1945, crashed into Mount Sobazan in Japan on a mission that was en route to delivering supplies to American POWs held in a POW camp nearby. All aboard this B-29 died when this plane crashed this mountain. It also included the plane's navigator, Captain Henry B. Baker of Greenville, Tennessee. What is interesting is you can see from the photo underneath a memorial, which is located at the crash site. You notice there are both Japanese American flags every year in September. The citizens of the townships around Mount Sobazan go with photos, go with remembrances, and go to recognize the Americans that died. And when we think about the viciousness of World War II, certainly World War II in the Pacific, the fact that here it is now, almost 80 years later, that the citizens of this tiny Japanese area, of these little communities, they're basically farming communities, would still go to put flowers and photographs to remember and honor the American crewmen who died is fairly remarkable. Another remarkable story, next slide, please, concerns the last American bomber to fall in the European campaign during 1945. And in this case, again, there was an East Tennessean aboard. This is actually probably one of the more famous bombers of its type used by the American Air Forces during World War II. The Black Cat was a B-24 Liberator bomber. The gentleman who you see in the lower right hand photograph is also seen in the group photo. He is second from the right on the bottom, wearing a slightly lighter coat, between one fella who is scrunching over with the cap and another guy who's got their mascot, their dog. This gentleman was named Howard Goodner. Howard Goodner was from Cleveland, Tennessee. He was one of the crewmen aboard this plane that got shot down over Bavaria a matter of days before Victory in Europe Day and the surrender of Germany occurred. His nephew, whose first memory from 1945 exists of being in a room full of flowers and a lot of really sad adults, turned out that he was actually at the funeral for his uncle, Howard Goodner, is a professor from the University of Pennsylvania named Tom Childers, who has written a book about this called On Wings of Morning. And it was through that the story of this, the last bomber to go down in World War II, became much better known by the American public. Next slide, please. As John alluded to, we also cover a lot of non-combat deaths, people who didn't actually occur, say, from a ship sinking or a plane being blown up or dying in combat on a battlefield. And this is an example of this. But what's also interesting is that until we started researching this, I certainly don't know about John, but I was not aware that we actually had a fighter ace hero in World War II who's from East Tennessee. And that was this man, Charleston resident James Sullins Varnell, better known to his friends as Sully. He was one of the leading U.S. Air Force aces in Italy, and pictured here in his photographs of his P-51 Little Eva, there he is strapping himself into the canopy in the cockpit in one, and the other he's with his crew chief. Sully shot down 17 Axis planes before he came home to become a flight instructor. After he returned home, he was sadly killed in a training clash in Florida on April 9th, 1945, less than a month before Victory in Europe Day. So again, we have another East Tennessean who fought bravely in combat, but then came home to die, not in combat, but in a non-combat death. And we have quite a few people who died in similar manners. He's just one of those stories. Next slide, please. The Korean War was certainly another war that had its elements of viciousness. And while it's often referred to as the Forgotten War, John and I hope that by memorializing the East Tennesseans who fell in Korea, that we're doing our own small part to help keep them from being forgotten. Some of the most tragic and grimmest stories occurred from the winter of 1950, when, as the Allied forces got closer to the Manchurian and Chinese borders and pressed further to North Korean, China basically came back with massive forces to push the Americans and other Allied forces back into South Korea. And that occurred at an area that was called the Chosin Reservoir. Part of that is remembered because of the saga of U.S. Marine forces that fought there. But on the edge of the Chosin Reservoir, there are also U.S. Army forces that were involved. And those were part of an element of the U.S. Army that was known as Task Force Faith. What happened to them was absolutely horrifying. They were cut off, basically abandoned. A few members of Task Force Faith were able to escape and get back to American lines, but many of them died and many of their bodies were lost for decades. That included several East Tennesseans. From left to right, you have Sergeant Bailey Keaton of Scott County. who died as part of the 2nd Infantry Division's Task Force Faith. His remains were only covered in 2004. Next to him is Sergeant First Class Louis Brickell of Chattanooga. Likewise, he was lost in that area. His remains were recovered in 2009. And then next to him is Corporal Samuel Harris of Rogersville, another member of Task Force Faith, who died in late November 1950, and his remains went unfound until 2009. So it may be worth remembering that, we only have an armistice with North Korea. Technically, we're still in a state of war with them. It's kind of a grim and scary thought that we often forget. But whenever there is a thawing in United States and North Korean relations, it seems that one benefit of that is that we're able to finally get more of these long lost soldiers, sailors, and airmen back to be buried finally at home in the United States. Next slide, please. One of the other incredible, unbelievable stories from the Korean War concerns the story of John Sadler, an East Tennessean who was from Johnson City. In 1952, June of 1952, communist North Korean and Chinese prisoners who were placed in a giant camp on an island off the South Korean coast called Kojido launched a massive prison riot. Ultimately, they captured the American general who was the commander of the POW camp, and the U.S. Army sent parachute troops in to liberate not just the general, but other military policemen and people who were being held hostage by the North Koreans and Chinese communist prisoners and restore order to the camp. One of those soldiers who went in was PFC John Sadler, again, a Johnson Cityan. Of all the brutality that occurred in suppressing these riots and restoring order, only one American died. That one American was John Sadler. And so you see an illustration of what John looked like in life. You see a photo that shows part of the rioting, the burning, everything going on at the Kojido campsite. But then you also see a collection of what was picked up and recovered from the communist prisoners, including spears, fake rifles, fake machine guns, other types of weapons, Molotov cocktails, etc. That was what John Sadler and his buddies went up against. And sadly, again, the only person to fall was an East Tennessee, and that was John Sadler. Next slide, please. In terms of the Vietnam War, we obviously have several hundred from East Tennessee who died and who we memorialize. One of them from one of the very first battles that were fought in a significant way by American forces in Vietnam. For those of you who either read the book or saw the movie, We Were Soldiers Once, the book being We Were Soldiers Once and Young, about Colonel Hal Moore and his unit, the 7th Cavalry. Sergeant Luther Gilreath was one of the best NCOs that served in the 7th Cavalry, part of the 1st Cavalry Division that fought in America's first major combat in Vietnam at the Ya Drang Valley in the fall of 1965. Sergeant Gilreath was from Burgoynesville. He was a career soldier. And on November 16th, 1965, at an area called Landing Zone X-Ray, his unit came under a massive ambush from North Korean regular forces. He was one of the men killed there. I think it says a lot about Sergeant Gilreath's reputation and how he was beloved, not just by his soldiers, but by the leadership of the 7th Cavalry. That when he went down, Colonel Hal Moore and his command sergeant major, a gentleman named Basil Plumley, went and looked for Luther Gilreath's body. They personally found his body and personally brought it back so he could be recovered. That alone, the fact that the commander and the senior non-commissioned officer in the middle of this combat would look for this sergeant, I think speaks volumes to his character and how beloved he was. And he was an East Tennessean. Next slide, please. We're now getting to the current and more recent wars. And certainly we all know that sadly we're having to add another name to the list as one of the 13 military service members who died recently in the flights out of Kabul was an East Tennessean, in fact, from our area. So we know that we're going to have another name added very shortly to the memorial for this poor soldier who died in the combat on behalf of the United States. There are others who we already recognize from these recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're going to talk about a few of them briefly. On the left, you see Knoxvillian Lieutenant Colonel Frank Bryant. He was a 16-year Air Force veteran, one of 8 airmen who was killed in April 2011 in a mass shooting incident Out of all places, the Kabul International Airport. History sure sometimes seems like it repeats itself, including the lives of our East Tennessee service members. The African-American gentleman you see in the right top is Captain Marcus Alford, a Fulton High School graduate from Knoxville, very well known, beloved by his classmates and by his teachers. And he and his co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Billy Jean Grinder, who served with the 230th Air Cavalry out at Mcgee Tyson Airport, coincidentally, were killed when their helicopter crashed outside Mosul, Iraq in February 2010, just days before they were due to come home to East Tennessee. On the bottom right is a McMinn Countyan who later lived in Lenore City, Specialist 4 Nathan Lillard. He was an infantryman with the 101st Airborne Division, killed in a firefight in the Kunar province of Afghanistan on November 14th, 2010. While the numbers of the dead and the casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan certainly pale in significance with the raw numbers of those who died in the First World War, in World War II, in Korea, and in Vietnam, the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial treasures the memory and honors the memory of each of these fine soldiers, sailors, and airmen who have died in these recent wars, and we do our part not to forget them. Now, before we go for Q&A, I have one last slide to show you all, and this is one that I think is going to have a lot of relevance to many, if not everyone, on this call today. Next slide, please. So I think that when you see the name of this young smiling aviator in both photos, but certainly as you're looking at the lower left-hand corner, you can figure out who I'm about to talk about. Yes, this is the father of retired U.S. Magistrate Judge Bob Marion, his father, Albert K. Marion, who served as an aviator in the United States Navy during World War II. As we were originally setting up the website for the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial Association, something that John has played a gigantic role in, and all credit and recognition are due to him for what he does in both setting it up and in maintaining it. At the time, I think Judge Marion was still serving on the bench, and he sent the ETVMA a letter. And I'm going to share an excerpt of that with you because I think it brings home what the consequences of the losses these people mean to immediate family members, but also to an entire community. And so I'll share a little bit of what Judge Bob Marion wrote about his father. My dad was born on January 26, 1922 in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he was known as Al. His parents moved to North Knoxville when he was young, and Al was graduated from Central High School. He was a gifted musician and played the trumpet and cornet. He played in several dance bands. He attended Maryville College, where he was also in the band and was a drum major, and his sport was wrestling. My mom was also raised in Knoxville. She was visiting my dad at Maryville College on December 7th, 1941. They both heard the news about Pearl Harbor on the radio, and they immediately knew that their lives would never be the same. I was born on April the 1st, 1945, while my dad was in the Pacific. He saw my picture before he died because it was returned with his personal belongings. When he and his bomber crew went missing in action on May 28, 1945, he was attached to Patrol Bombing Squadron 133 in the Asiatic area. My middle name, Philip, comes from a man he flew with, Philip Olson. Mr. Olson survived the war, and I visited with him and his wife in Beverly, Massachusetts. He told me how he and other pilots spent days searching the area where my dad's plane was thought to have gone down. I have a letter signed by President Truman that states in part that my dad stands in the unbroken line of patriots who have dared to die, that freedom might live and grow and increase its blessings. Freedom lives, and through it he lives, in a way that humbles the undertakings of most men. I believe that to be true. I think that is powerful testimony from one son about the father he never got to know, a man who was lost and his body was never found. And Ensign Albert Marion is commemorated on the tablets of the missing at the Punch Bowl in Hawaii. So with that, last slide is just an informational slide about the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial Association. I'm off the board. I still consider myself to be a loyal ally and friend of ETVMA, and certainly I know that John absolutely feels that way as well. If you'd like to learn more about the ETVMA as well as our book, feel free to go to the ETVMA website. We provide the link there. If you have any questions, you can also write them or call them by phone. And at this point in time, John and I would be delighted to take any questions or comments that you have about the presentation, about our research about the book or about the ETVMA. So I'll open it up with that.
Anybody? Anybody got any questions, comments? I thought the presentation was wonderful, Nick. I enjoyed all the history behind it, and John, it was great.
Thank you. Nick, about the book, do we want to say anything about procuring a book?
Oh, please go ahead. Why don't you have the honors?
Well, you have different ways it's published by UT Press. It came out, well, it was delayed because of COVID. I think it finally reached us around March of last year, February, March. But you can order it on Amazon, of course, UT Press. I think they maybe have it at the East Tennessee History Center. And so I think you'll enjoy reading. There are a lot of stories that obviously were not talked about today that are in the book.
I'll also add that at least a couple of weeks ago, I was at Union Avenue Books, and at least 2 copies were available then. So I would say go to Union Ave Books, and if they run out, they can reorder them for you. Get them while they're hot, I think John and I would say. One thing I think I might add as well is that, for both John and me, I think we both used the expression earlier that writing this was a labor of love, and it's absolutely true. I don't think it is maudlin to say, I certainly think it's appropriate as well, since we're looking at Veterans Day, that in researching and writing about these lives, it's hard not to feel a pang of sadness in many occasions, because the circumstances in which these men and women were lost, it's terrible. It's sad. You think about, obviously when I read that letter from Bob Meering about his father, you think about the potentialities that his father had. You think about how Judge Meering's life might have been different if he ever knew his father. You think about all those questions of the things that didn't occur and the changes made in people's lives because somebody was no longer seated at the family table anymore, or there to hold his date by the hand and take a walk, on a beautiful fall night, down a country lane. You have to think about that. And I don't think that it is any way overly sentimental to do so, but it certainly, as John and I wrote about it, there were times that I would say that we both were heavily moved, and I think you well should be. I think anyone reading this book, you will have those moments. So if that needs to be said as a trigger warning or something like that, there certainly are some stories in here that are going to be extremely sad, but I think we owe it to the family members, to the succeeding generations, to remember these folks. They were people like us from this area. They lived and died in East Tennessee, and if they didn't die in East Tennessee, their deaths certainly had consequences for those who remain here, and they should be celebrated. They should be commemorated appropriately. And
also, I might add that we receive no royalties from the sale of these books. All the royalties go to the East Tennessee Veterans Memorial for its maintenance and preservation.
I've also been monitoring the IM feed, and thank you all who've made some comments on that. Peter, I'm just going to single out to you. You made an excellent comment, which is in saying that this book and these stories make you think about the true cost of war. I absolutely can only second that. It really does bring home the meaning of what it is to send young men and women to combat, because consequences like these often are inevitable. And it's something that I've said to John, at least, and I don't mind sharing in form with you all, is that there are times I have wished that if it were in my power to get every politician or anyone running for office in East Tennessee to take at least 15 minutes to go to that memorial and have either John or I or a member of the ETVMA share some of these stories with them. I think that would be a powerful moment, and something that anyone who is planning on serving our country in a leadership or political role, I certainly think it'd be worth their time.
Thank you, Nick and John. It's a great presentation. Appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining us today, attending. I'm going to, if you'd like to watch this again or share it with someone, I'm going to, we'll have it up as a YouTube link on our website, hopefully by the end of the week. So be watching for that. So thank you again, guys, for doing this for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all for joining us today.
It's been great. Thank you so much.